watching PowerNation.
Today, it's all about paint, power, and P-pumps as we swap out our old VE for something a little more spicy.
That's right, we're cracking open this Cummins to inject plenty of power into this old 12 valve, so make sure you stick around and check it all out today on Music City Trucks.
Nothing cooler than an old pickup, am I right?
Underneath all this dirt, there's probably a pretty good truck.
After some sweat from our brow, we've got our 5.9 12-valve Cummins sitting on the engine stand, ready to rock and roll. We plucked this thing out of our Ram W350 that we have christened as Project Nightshift. And in all honesty, fun's just beginning.
That's right. We've got a long, long list of performance parts we want to bolt onto this thing and a tried and true recipe to make it look awesome. But before we do that, we've got to get it sealed up, sprayed down, and ready for paint. I've seen a lot of rough-looking engines come through this shop with a lot less miles on them, but once we pressure wash and scrub down this 6BT Cummins, it should probably look pretty close to brand new.
Good news is, by the time this bucket's filled, it'll be lunchtime.
Oh yeah.
You can smell that degreaser from here, though. That's the good stuff. A lot better than most 170,000 mile engines I've seen. Anytime you're cleaning an engine outside like we are, you always want to limit your effect on the environment. So we're actually using a water-based engine cleaner. You can also just use some dish soap or whatever's at your disposal. All right, we'll let that degreaser soak in a few minutes and then we'll give her another spray down.
See if we can get this turbo busted off of here.
Good luck on that manifold. Looks like some of them bolts are welded on there.
Oh man, that's half the fun. Don't you just love dealing with old exhaust components?
Can't say that I do.
No, man, it gives you, you know, if you're having a bad day, it gives you something to get angry at.
Not wrong on that one.
At least with this one, we're replacing everything, so.
Now, for the most part, we are pulling off all the accessories, but we're gonna keep our VE pump and our power steering pump on for now. And there's a reason for it. Both of these are tied into the timing on the engine, so to pull those off, we'd have to pull off the timing cover and all that jazz. And we're not looking to get into all that quite yet, but we will a little bit later on. So for right now, we're just gonna mask these off, and then we'll touch up the paint later. A little tight.
90% of the time, it works 60% of the time. I said that backwards, but.
It's just because you're used to working on a rusty old Ford.
Beautiful.
About to get oil all over your engine stand here, Eric.
Call that rust preventative.
Right. Makes you wonder if I'm even here right now.
I don't know if anything's here anymore.
Fumes from the diesel.
Well, I think that's just about everything we need off there for right now. Get this thing over to the booth.
Oh.
Make sure all these fittings are sealed off.
Yeah, anywhere there's a sensor or access to the combustion chamber or anything of any of the internals.
Yeah, I don't think we want to get any of this paint inside the crankcase.
I don't know. I've heard paint adds like 10, 15 horsepower.
I mean, it is a Cummins, so it probably wouldn't hurt it any.
It doesn't matter if you're doing like a hood or a door or an engine. At the end of the day, it all comes down to the prep work.
Well, you've got to have a good base for anything you're doing.
More specifically on an engine, and I've seen this a lot, is got to have a clean base and a clean surface area because paint is not mixed well with any carbon buildup. Diesel in this case, or oil, like all that stuff's just got to be cleaned up.
Well, yeah, stuff like that, that just makes the paint jump right off, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, and especially with the solvents, like anything with brake clean or anything like that, you know, your paint and your hardeners are all covalently bonded, and when you expose them to those elements and they just start fighting each other, the whole thing just falls apart.
I can rattle can with the best of them, but I haven't really done a whole lot of proper painting, as it were.
I'm all about crash courses.
Heavy on the crash.
Now you guys may have noticed that we didn't do any prep work on our valve covers. That's because we're going to be replacing these with some aftermarket ones. So it's okay if we keep them on there for now, just so we don't get any overspray on our valve train.
And the same thing goes for our timing cover. That's going to be getting replaced as well, so we're going to leave it unmasked. Up next, I boldly go where I've never gone before, the paint booth. This is definitely an upgrade from doing a rattle can refurb.
Well, I think our epoxy's pretty much flashed off.
Yeah, it looks pretty good. Almost don't even need the paint.
Well, you say that, but I think it's going to look pretty good with that P.O.R 15 black on it.
Oh, definitely.
And because we sprayed that epoxy, we got less of a chance of any of that old rattle can paint lifting on us. Why don't you go suit up and I'll mix you up some paint.
Sounds good.
Now, as we mentioned before, we're going to be using the black engine enamel that we got from the guys at P.O.R 15. Now, technically, you don't have to reduce this stuff, but I prefer to because I feel like it sprays out of the gun a little bit better. And the tech sheet says you're allowed to do that. Now, there is a certain way to do it if you want to do a 10% reduction. Easiest way to do it is with a digital scale. Set your measuring cup down, and then we'll go ahead and zero it there. We'll go ahead and dump in our paint. We're going to need quite a bit for that big old Cummins engine, so I'm just going to dump what's left in the can in here. Okay, so it looks like we are at about 200 milliliters, so that means we need 20 milliliters of reducer. 20 milliliters is not a whole lot, so you just kind of dump it in a little drop at a time. It's about 19 and a half. We'll call that good. You can kind of see how the paint rolls off the paint stick nice and smooth. It's exactly what you're going for. If it's kind of clumpy and falling into the paint cup, well, add just a little bit more reducer. I think I'm going to call that good.
Now, I know we had to do a lot of prep work so I could use the spray gun on here, but this is definitely an upgrade from doing a rattle can refurb. It is way easier to control the flow and get an even spread on this P.O.R 15. Adding that reducer seems to have helped too, because this is coming out and laying down really smooth.
Well, Eric, I don't know what you're so nervous about, because looks like it turned out pretty good.
That does look pretty good.
Looks like she's still a little bit tacky, so I think we'll let her sit overnight and then start adding some power to this thing.
Sounds good.
Well, after a quick chucker bath and a few coats of paint, we've got our old 12-valve Cummins sitting here styling and profiling, and we're ready to bolt on some power. When it comes to that subject matter, one of the most common upgrades a lot of you diesel dudes like to do is to swap out your VE pump for a P7100 injection pump. With a VE pump, you have a single plunger trying to supply fuel to all 6 injectors. But with a P pump, you have 6 individual plungers to supply fuel to all 6 injectors. So you have better fuel efficiency, more importantly, more power. We are slapping on a larger turbo on this thing, so we need a more efficient pump to maintain our air to fuel ratio. And I wish I could sit here and tell you guys that this is a fairly easy and straightforward process, but in all honesty, there is a lot to it. But don't worry, we're gonna walk you through each and every step. But before we touch anything, we need to make sure that this engine is sitting at top dead center. Before we get started, we're gonna remove our valve cover off our #1 cylinder and zip off the timing cover. Now, some of these timing cover bolts are longer than the others, so make sure you keep track of which ones go where. There are several different methods to finding top dead center on your old 12 valve. By far one of the easiest is to use your timing pin. Now basically this is just a little button that sits on the back side of your cam gear and your timing case. So as you rotate the engine over, apply a little bit of pressure to that pin, and once your cam gear reaches top dead center, that pin will slide into a little shoulder on the back side of that cam gear. The next method is to go off of your timing marks. Now if you take a look at your VE pump gear, your cam gear, and your crankshaft, you've got 4 different markings, each one of them with their own corresponding color. So as you spin the engine over, your blue should line up with your blue, and your white should line up with your white. And then finally, there's the more traditional method of pulling the valve cover off your number 1 cylinder and cycling your valve train. Your intake valve should do a complete cycle of going all the way down and all the way up, and then it'll start to compress your exhaust valve, and once it's all the way seated, you should be within the ballpark of TDC. You'll just need to double check that with one of the other methods. Since our flex plate is off, we can use our crankshaft pulley bolts to help spin the engine and line up our marks. I'm taping these bolts up just so I don't accidentally mar up the threads. Gotta protect them like a newborn baby. All right, we're gonna spin the engine over now, line up our timing marks, and I'm also paying attention to my valve train, making sure that it's cycling correctly. These old Cummins got some serious compression behind them, so you may have to get a little stern when trying to crank it over. All right, got all of our timing marks lined up. Our dowel on our crankshaft is in the 12 o'clock position, and our timing pin is in. So we are sitting at top dead center. Coming up, it's time to put this Cummins front and center.
Just like that.
Well, we got our engine sitting at top dead center, and the reason why this is so important is because both a VE and a P pump run off the timing of the engine. So if you pull the pump off, spin the engine over, and then reinstall the pump, your injectors are going to fire out of order. But with quadruple confirmation that this thing is sitting at top dead center, we're ready to pull that timing gear. Now, ideally in this situation, you would use a gear puller or even maybe a harmonic balancer puller to get this thing out of here. But for some of you guys who understandably may not want to shell out any kind of coin to buy a specialty tool, all you really need is a pair of M8 125 bolts to pop this thing off of here. As I tighten these bolts down, they're going to press up against the back side of the timing case. I'm just going to kind of turn them 1 to 2 times on each side, just that way that gear is pulling off nice and evenly. The next thing we're going to pop off is our fuel supply line. And then we've got 3 bolts on the timing case and then 1 more bolt on the power steering bracket. I only added in 2 threads. I thought it'd be smoother than that. By far, one of the biggest hurdles you're going to run into when you're doing this swap is, unfortunately, having to pull your camshaft. But before we get into all that, I've got a really cool trick I want to show you guys on how to keep your tappets from falling down into the oil pan. While I'm gathering supplies for that, I'm going to tag Eric in so that he can show you how to organize your top end.
That's right. Now, actually removing your valve train is not all that hard, but keeping it in order is extremely important because as your engine racks up the miles, the internal components develop wear patterns where they make contact. So if you plan on reusing what you pull out, it's really important to make sure that it all goes back in the same places. Now, taking it apart is pretty easy, like I mentioned before, and keeping it organized can be just as easy. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can remove everything. You know, you can do 1 cylinder at a time, or you can do them all in stages. I'm gonna start by pulling the covers off. And away we go. Ooh, there we go. I'm trying to leave these push rods in for right now. Make this a little easier on ourselves and just crack all these loose at once. That way we can grab an impact, take them all out real quick and get everything out of the way. Dirty old diesel. Now, with the rocker arm assemblies removed, it's time to take the push rods out. And this is where organization becomes really important because push rods are one of the things that actually wear in as your engine runs. And to show you just how that happens, we're gonna measure them as we take them out. Now, when you first install a set of push rods, generally they all come in the exact same length. But as they wear in, the length is gonna change on each one of them, and it's gonna change a different amount. This is measured in at 275.67 millimeters. And we'll measure the second one. It's 275.82 millimeters. Now, that might not sound like that much of a difference, but inside of an engine, even 1/1000th of an inch or 1/100th of a millimeter is gonna make a big difference. With all of our push rods removed, we can go ahead and remove the tappet cover off the side of our engine. Quick and easy. Loosen these up. Get this fuel line out of the way. Separate. It's not really what this scraper is for, but it was the closest thing that'll work. Just like that. Easy day. Well, now that we've got that cover off of there and access to what we need, it's time for Joel to come in and work his magic. Coming up, we want to up your pump.
I mean, this thing just screams performance. It's basically another inline-six engine in itself. With our valve train out of the way, we're one step closer to getting that camshaft out. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier about a little trick about keeping your tappets in so that they don't fall down to the oil pan. It does require a specialty tool, however, and that would be a 1/2-inch wooden dowel. Now, you can pick these up at your local home supply store for relatively cheap. And for this application, I actually had to chop them down into little 1-inch sections along with drilling a 7/32 pilot hole so that way I can fit in these little eyelets. Basically, the idea is to take each of these dowels and hammer them down into the tappets. Then we'll run some mechanics wire through the eyelets and tie it up so the tappets won't fall into the crankcase when we pull the camshaft. First step we gotta do is get these hammered in. All right, with our dowels in place, we're good to start running some wire. Basically, I'll feed it through both eyelets and wrap it around this bolt, and that should hold them up as we pull the camshaft so that everything is good to go and it won't fall down into the oil pan. All right, with our tappets safely in place, we're good to pull the camshaft. All that basically entails is a couple of retainer bolts. Slowly, gently pull this thing out of here. Yahtzee. All right, with our camshaft out, good to pull this timing case. Not to mention give this old Cummins a little bit of a facelift. Now, of course, we can't tear into the timing assembly on an old Cummins without addressing the infamous killer dowel pin. For many of you at home, well, this thing was the bane of your existence. Basically what happens is this little guy over time starts to wiggle out, and sometimes it'll land on the crank gears, or if you get lucky, it'll land in the oil pan. But most of the time, it causes detrimental damage. So what are the solutions? Well, you could weld it up, or you could just pull it out, or you could take a spare piece of metal, build you a little tab that goes over it, and that'll hold it in place. The original owner of this truck already swapped out the stock cam for a 480 lift cam. And we've inspected all of our journals as well as all the cam bearings, so we're just gonna put this bad boy right back in there. You want to be sure to take special care when reinstalling your camshaft so you don't damage your journals or any of the cam bearings. Line up our timing mark. Torque spec on your cam retainer bolts is 18 pound-feet. Cool. Cam is in. Well guys, the time is upon us. We're finally ready to stab in our P7100 pump. But before we do, I just wanted to take a step back and show you guys the sheer physical size difference between these two pumps. I mean, this thing just screams performance. It's basically another inline-six engine in itself. And really, you just got to get it in there far enough to where you can get a nut on it, and then you can use the nuts to seat it the rest of the way. All right, we got our pump completely cinched up. One thing I did run into is that each bolt had to be individually tightened in kind of like a star pattern just so that it's seated evenly on that O-ring seal. Next step is to get our timing gear on. Make sure that when you order this kit that you get a new timing gear because the P pump and the VE pump use different gears, so make sure you get that swapped out as well. With our new pump gear installed, I'm gonna go ahead and redo some of our timing marks. Now, one more thing I want to point out to you guys is that we bought this pump completely refurbished and stage 2 upgraded. So it's already set at 12 degrees. But if you're doing this swap at home, you can buy the timing tool and it'll cost you about 150 bucks.
Well, with timing gear reinstalled and the P-pump conversion pretty much finished up, it's time to move on to getting our new injectors installed. And of course, before we can put the new ones in, we've got to get these old ones out. Here's hoping that none of them are too stuck. Now, These aren't just any old injectors that we're using to update what was already in there. These are competition injectors with a higher flow rating than the ones that we pulled out. Now what that's gonna do is allow more fuel in, and as long as we can get more air in there as well, it's gonna produce more power. Now we made sure when we got these that we ordered with the same spray pattern as the factory injectors, because we didn't change out our pistons, so we don't wanna end up causing any issues inside. You also want to make sure you get your detent ball lined up with the slot. That way you can get your injector fully seated. And as you're tightening, you'll feel that alignment ball on there kind of slip in, because it'll start to stiffen up a little bit if it's not perfectly lined up, but then it'll twist itself just a little bit and loosen up again. Now, with our injectors reinstalled and everything torqued to spec, we need to get our feed lines installed from the P-pump. Now, it's fairly straightforward getting these lines put on because they came with the injectors, so they're already pre-formed and pre-bracketed to fit where they're supposed to go. So I went ahead and loosened up the brackets that hold them together. That way we can shift and adjust as necessary. Well, that just about does it. Just gotta get these brackets tight and throw a couple more things back on, and this Cummins is done. Now we got a lot done today, but obviously we still have a lot left to bolt onto this thing before we drop it back into the engine bay of our 93 W350.
For sure. So we're gonna take a little break from this for right now. We're gonna crawl up underneath that Dodge, see what we can do about lifting its spirits. But until then, get your truckers next time.
Now, speaking of spirits, it's 5 o'clock somewhere.
I don't know, man, I'm afraid of ghosts.